Hello there once again, class. Good to see you again. Today, for our lecture on the book of Leviticus, the third of the 5 books in the Pentateuch. Now, most of the time, when people set out to start reading the Bible through in a year, they'll get through Genesis and Exodus no problem, and then usually around March or April, they'll get to Leviticus. And that's where the wheels come off and they just give up because it's just material that is not interesting to them, or it's boring, or it's repetitive. But I actually love the book of Leviticus. If you consider yourself a rule follower, then Leviticus is for you. Plus, it has some really interesting things to say about the culture of the Israelites and the person and the nature of God himself. So let's jump in and we'll see some of this as we go throughout it. So as I mentioned, each one of the books in the Pentateuch does not have a title in Hebrew. It's just the first word or phrase in the book. And here the phrase is, "and he called." We get our English title from the Greek translation, the Septuagint, that called the book Leviticus. You can see the word Levite in there, which in Greek, Leviticus means things pertaining to priests. So the book of Leviticus takes place all at Mount Sinai. The people are still encamped there after their exodus out of Egypt. And the theme is pretty simple to find throughout the book, and it is pervasive in the book. Be holy, for I am holy. One of the clearest descriptions of that is in Leviticus chapter 11. And because God himself is holy, and his people are to be a reflection of who he is, his people are supposed to be holy as well. Now again, I think that there's some great value in the book of Leviticus. Concerning the nature of God, it helps us understand his eminence, his presence with his people, and it also helps us understand his holiness and his requirement for his people to live a holy lifestyle as well. 2 basic concepts are sacrifice and atonement. And one of the major sections in the book of Leviticus outlines the 5 major sacrifices that Israel was to practice. And it does have a lot to say about today for those who call upon the name of Jesus and who follow him. It reminds us that God's standards of holiness have not changed. The practice of that might have changed, but we as followers of God through Jesus still should strive to live a holy lifestyle. We also see some of the roots of our own religious institutions today. The whole idea of worship. Now, for the Israelites, it looked a bit different than ours does today. There wasn't a praise band or anything like that. Their mode of worshiping was basically sacrifice. The New Testament tells us now that as believers, our sacrifice is a sacrifice of praise and of our own bodies on the altar. We also see the roots of the church, not just the church building, although we do see that in the tabernacle, as we talked about last time at the end of Exodus, but also the church as a congregation, as a body, as a community of faith. We see that as Israel gathers together for corporate worship throughout the year on their holy days. And then we also see the roots of the modern day minister. And there are some religious faith systems that still call them priests. But regardless of whether you call it a priest or a pastor, we see here these individuals that are standing in between the people and God. Now, Gordon Wenham has written a fantastic commentary on the book of Leviticus, and he describes, and rightly so, and outlines that there are basically three categories of people and things in the book of Leviticus. Things and people are either holy, common, or unclean. Holy items are those that are set aside specifically for God's purposes. Common items are everyday items that you would use, and unclean items are those that you should avoid altogether. Items can move up and down in people. The scale here, a holy item can become common if it's used for a purpose that is not of God's purpose. And when that happens, it's said to be profaned. It can also move from common to unclean and is said to be polluted when that happens. But items can also move up the scale. An unclean item can become common through sacrifice, and it's said to be cleansed. A second sacrifice can move a common item up to holy, and it is said to be sanctified. Now, these items and people move up and down this scale, or move down the scale rather, through sin or disease. And Leviticus outlines exactly what these sins and diseases are. So, again, just to summarize, holy items set aside for worship, common items for everyday use, unclean items have no use at all. Items move down the scale because sin or uncleanness, up by way of sacrifice. Let's say, for instance, a holy golden bowl that is used in the tabernacle, that someone uses it to eat out of. Well, that's a common practice, not a holy one. Therefore, it has become common. But let's say that bowl was used by a person with a disease. Well, because that person is unclean and they've touched the bowl, now the bowl becomes unclean. So it would have to move back up the scale through the way of sacrifice in order to be used in the tabernacle again. I find this diagram very helpful for understanding what's going on in the book of Leviticus. Well, the first major section, the first 7 chapters, are all about the 5 major sacrifices in Israel. And the reasons for these were atonement for sin or uncleanness, but some of them are sacrifices that are made simply to say thank you to God and express gratitude. And then there's also an element of fellowship or community in some of the sacrifices as well. If you remember last week, we talked about the 2 most important pieces in the tabernacle structure. The bronze basin for washing after making an offering on the altar of burnt offering, which was basically like a big barbecue pit. Would have had a grill over it where the animal was sacrificed and then ultimately burned with coals underneath it. Well, so let's talk about these 5 major sacrifices quickly. The most popular one, and the one that is usually when someone makes a sacrifice in the Old Testament, is called the whole burnt offering. We see David making whole burnt offerings in the book of 2 Samuel. So in the whole burnt offering, the sacrifice, the animal, has to be a healthy male animal, either a bull or a ram or a bird if the sacrificer couldn't afford a bull or a ram. The sacrificer lays the hands on the animal, then the worshiper slays the animal. The priest take the blood, sprinkle it all around the altar, and then the entire remains of the animal are all burned there on the altar. And the purpose for this is a voluntary act of worship to atone for unintentional sin in general. Now, this is not a mandated sacrifice. Really, there's only one out of the 5 that's mandated. So again, this was a voluntary act. The grain offering in chapter 2 describes the procedure in that grain is to be prepared in a cake along with oil and salt, but no leaven, no yeast can be used, so the grain cake will not rise. After the cake is prepared, it's taken to the tabernacle. Part of it's burned on the altar, The other part is given to the priests. If you remember, one of the items inside the tabernacle structure was the table of the bread of presence. This is how the priests got enough food, was by the offering of these people. And again, this is purely out of gratitude for God. Perhaps after a really great crop one year, you would make this sacrifice to say thank you to the Lord. The third offering is the peace offering, or the fellowship offering is also called. Here, it's similar to the whole burnt, but instead of all of the animal being burned, only part of it is burned on the altar. The other part is eaten by the worshipers and the priests together in a community meal. Perhaps this is the beginning of the potluck dinner. I mean, people in church love to eat, and they love to eat together. Here we see some shades of that, because this is a mutual celebration of Thanksgiving between the priests and the people. Now, the most important sacrifice of the five was called the purification, or the sin offering. And all of the other sacrifices get one chapter of description. This one gets two, because it is so important. The procedure is similar to the whole burnt. The animal slaughtered, the blood is sprinkled around the altar. However, only part of the animal is burned on the altar. The other part is taken outside of the camp and burned outside of the camp, symbolizing the sin of the individual leaving the area of where the Israelites were camping. It's prescribed for four distinct groups. The priests would sacrifice a bull, for the congregation, a young bull, for the ruler, the king, a male goat, and for an individual, a female goat or a lamb. Now, why all the detail here, and why the instructions for every single group? Well, it's a reminder that everyone in Israel had sinned and needs atonement and forgiveness. This is the only one of the five that is mandatory. And it's mandatory for specific unintentional sin or confession of a sin and forgiveness. It's a reminder that every single instance of failing to obey God's law, whether it's intentional or not, required a sacrifice to make the offender pure and holy once again. Well, the last offering is called the reparation offering, or the guilt offering. And the procedure is exactly the same as the sin offering. Here, however, this one was done when you wronged someone specifically, another person. And the reason that it's the same as the purification is because sinning against a person is also a sin against God. And so you have to be made right with both God and the person. And the restitution would also be required by the offender to the tune of 120%. So let's say that you dug a hole behind your tent in the Israelite camp, and your neighbor's cow fell in the hole and had to be killed. Well, even though you didn't mean to kill your neighbor's cow, you're still responsible for being right with God, right with your neighbor, and giving your neighbor 120% in return, which I'm not sure what 120% of a cow is. Maybe the priest would make a financial decision about how much that would be, or maybe you give them another cow and then a baby cow. I don't know. But the purpose here was for atonement and restitution. Well, these make up the five major sacrifices in Israel. And it seems strange to us, and it seems foreign to us, until we remember that the whole purpose of this was to remind the people that it should really be them on the altar, not this innocent animal who has done nothing to deserve the death that is going to befall them. But it should really be the person who has committed the sin. and to remind Israel that there's nothing great and nothing grand and nothing wonderful about sin, but that it destroys and it kills. And then we're reminded of the Gospels when John the Baptist sees Jesus coming and says, look, it's the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And we can be grateful that Jesus has become that perfect sacrifice on our behalf. Well, a couple of other things of note. One is that Aaron and his son are formally instituted as the priests. They're also given, in addition to their priestly garment, they're given something called the Urim and the Thummim. Now, there's not a whole lot of detail over what exactly these were. The word Urim means light, and the word Thummim means dark. The theory I like is that the priests would carry these in their garment, and when you had a specific request that you wanted to make to God, you would ask it. These would be light on one side, dark on the other. The priest would jumble them up and then pull them out. And if you got a light, the answer was yes. If you got a dark, the answer was no. But if you got one light, one dark, the answer was ask again later. Like a magic 8-ball or something like that. Now, I know this, again, seems strange and arbitrary to us, kind of like rolling dice to make a decision. But God designated this method as a method of discerning His will. Again, thankfully, we don't have to rely on the Urim and the Thummim anymore. As followers of Jesus, we have the power of the Holy Spirit at our disposal. Well, the last major section of the book of Leviticus has to do with the holy days in Israel. And the most important of these was the Day of Atonement, also called in Hebrew Yom Kippur, in chapter 16. Now here, a bull would be sacrificed on behalf of the sins of the high priest. Some of the blood from that bull would be taken into the Holy of Holies. This was the only day of the year that the priest could go in there, the high priest. And some of the blood would be sprinkled on the mercy seat, this area where the wings of the cherubs on top of the ark were touching. Then they would take a goat, and the first goat would be sacrificed. Some of the blood of the goat would be sprinkled on the mercy seat as well to atone for the entire nation of Israel's sins. Then the second goat would be taken in front of the people. The priest would stand before the people, place his hands on the head of the goat, confess the sins of the people, and then send the goat out of the camp. And in a sense, this became the scapegoat. And it was symbolic of the sin of the people being removed from their presence. So the scapegoat was the sin of the people leaving the camp on the Day of Atonement. Now, one thing that we have to talk about just a little bit has to do with how we interpret these Levitical laws, especially in this middle section between chapters 11 and 19, where it talks about everything from the foods that you're supposed to eat to what you're supposed to do if there is mold in your house, to familial relations. Well, I would suggest that most of these in the book of Leviticus are what are called culture-specific laws, given expressly to the nation of Israel that addressed their specific setting. For instance, Leviticus 19:23 through 25 talks about if they planted a tree and how for 3 years they're not to eat the fruit of that tree. And then the 4th year, they're to give the fruit as an offering. And only in the 5th year are they able to eat the fruit from that tree. Now, does that mean that if I plant a tree in my backyard, that I'm not supposed to eat the fruit from it for 5 years. Again, I think that most of the laws in Leviticus are culture-specific laws versus apodictic laws. Apodictic is a word that means without limitation. In other words, universal law, much like the Ten Commandments or the Decalogue, with much more sweeping nature in tone. Now, we do know that in Mark 7:19, Jesus declared all foods clean. That means that followers of Jesus can have things like shellfish, lobster. They can have things like bacon, which would be off of the menu according to Leviticus. Colossians 2:14 also says that the written code that was against us, the law code, not the apodictic type laws, was canceled when Jesus died on the cross. Now, there are many that disagree with this perspective, and you can feel free to disagree with it as well. However, I would suggest that with the exception of the Ten Commandments, all of which are mentioned in some form by Jesus in the New Testament, it seems as if much of the law in Exodus and Leviticus does not apply to modern-day Christians. It's of interest because it gives us an insight into their culture and the requirements of holiness. But it's not necessary for us to follow these laws as New Testament believers. However, if you decide that you are going to follow them, you got to follow all of them. And you got to do it all the time. It's an all or nothing type thing. Well, we have to wrap up. And the last thing I want to talk to you about are the holy days in chapters 23 through 25. And this last section of Leviticus describes throughout the Hebrew calendar year what they were supposed to celebrate and these holy days or holidays that they had. The first one was the Sabbath day. This was pretty simple. It was every seventh day. And this was a day of rest and renewal and worship. They were not supposed to do any work on the Sabbath day. We've lost a little bit of that in our culture. Even when I was a child, I remember going to the mall to eat at Luby's after church, and Luby's was the only thing that was open in the mall. In Israel, they still take the Sabbath day very seriously. Everything's closed. You can't catch a bus. You can't find a taxi. And so it's still something that they practice very, very strictly. Well, every seventh year, they were to practice the Sabbath year. And the intention here was to let the land regenerate and to lie fallow for an entire year, to prepare for that year leading up to it, but then not work the land and not sow the fields or prune the vineyards. Now, the year of Jubilee was every 50th year. So on the 49th year, you'd have a Sabbath year. Then the 50th year, you'd have the year of Jubilee. No work was to be done. All land was to revert back to its original owners. All the debts would be canceled, and all Hebrew slaves were to be set free. Now, this year of Jubilee, the purpose was to prevent perpetual indebtedness, perpetual slavery. It was also to make sure that not just a few people had control of the land, but that it went back to its original owners. Now, the tragic thing about the year of Jubilee is even though the Lord mandated it in Leviticus, there's no evidence that Israel ever practiced the year of Jubilee. There's not a whole lot of evidence to show that they practiced the Sabbath year or even the Sabbath day that much during the Old Testament period. Well, probably the most important day other than Yom Kippur was the Feast of Passover. This is still the most important day among the Jewish people. Every spring, every few years, it lines up with Easter as it did on the weekend that Jesus was crucified. But Passover is still a very big deal to the Jewish people because it's a reminder of God's rescue of Israel from slavery in Egypt. Now, the rest of these, very quickly, the Feast of Weeks celebrated the beginning of wheat harvest. You can see this in the book of Ruth. This was early summer. The Feast of Trumpets, also called Rosh Hashanah, which is literally the head of the year. This is the beginning of the Jewish New Year, every September or October, sometime in early fall. The Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, as we just discussed, this was just a couple of weeks after Rosh Hashanah, every September or October. And then shortly after that, the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths, also called Sukkot, which is the Hebrew word for booths, also celebrated in September or October. A few years ago, my wife Heather and I took a trip in October to the Bahamas. And the resort where we were staying, I guess there were a lot of people there that it was during the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot. And so they had these tabernacles set up, these tents, where they would celebrate each night with this huge meal. And it was a reminder of the Israelites' period of time during the wilderness. Now, why talk about all these, and why did the Lord mandate all of these? Well, the purpose is that God knew, I think, that if He didn't tell us that we had to rest, that we probably wouldn't rest. We would work ourselves to death. And so God told His people here in Leviticus, there are times that you're just going to have to stop. And you're going to have to cease from work and dedicate these times to me. Now, adding all of these days up, you come up with 70 days. That's 19%, almost 2.5 months of the Hebrews' year that was to be spent resting and or celebrating. That's a lot, if you think about it. That's almost 20%. That's almost a fifth of their year. Now in America, assuming that we rest all 52 Sundays, which that's a big assumption, especially for those of us in church work, and if we took all the federal holidays, that's also a really big assumption, then that gives us about 65 days to rest. Less than the Israelites, but still kind of close. The point of me saying all this is that I hope that you take rest and celebrating holy days very seriously. Because as you can see from Leviticus, God takes it very seriously. And in doing so, it's not just good for us, but it also is glorifying to Him. It brings Him glory when we are at our best. And we are only at our best when we're not completely exhausted. So, having said all that, go take a nap and go enjoy whatever holiday is coming up next. Well, you can see there's a lot of great stuff in Leviticus, and I hope that you will dive into it deeper and that you'll study it a little bit more, and I'm happy to have spent this time talking to you about it today. Hope you have a great day. See you next time. Bye.